welcome to Conversations with Dr. Stephen Greer. This is Dr. Greer, and I'd like to thank the people at the World Fusion Network for hosting us here every 2 weeks and allowing us to bring you an update on disclosureproject.org and the orionproject.org and CSETI.org. And I'm really happy to have with me today Dr. Jan Bravo, who's a fellow emergency physician who is on the board of directors of the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence and Disclosure Project, and has been involved with this work for over 13 years now, and it's really wonderful that you can be here with us today. Thank you, Jan.
I'm glad to be here, Steve.
Oh, good. So here's what we're going to talk about today. It's actually really a two-part program, and we're going to do it again and continue it in a couple of weeks. So there's so much to cover, and many people have written in asking questions about this. And since it's the World Fusion Network, people on this show more than anyone in the world really understand the meaning of the science of consciousness and the meaning of the Vedic sciences. And what I want to do is go through a connection of how these sciences and the sort of space-age interstellar contact that we're having are related, and what the challenges are to understanding it and to documenting it and all of that. And in terms of framing that discussion, I know Dr. Bravo, you mentioned something to my wife today that I thought was interesting that I think would be great if you shared it with the audience, just to sort of give people a concept of the way science kind of works and doesn't work sometimes.
Okay. Well, as I'm sure most of the audience is aware, the Nobel Peace Prizes for this year were announced over the last few days. And just yesterday, the Nobel Peace Prize in Chemistry was awarded to a Dr. Dan Shechtman. Now, Dr. Shechtman was doing research in the United States in the 80s, and he discovered a new chemical structure, and this is called quasi-crystals. Before he proposed his theory, researchers thought that it was impossible, that these didn't exist. And what it is, he found that atoms were arranged in a pattern that never repeated itself, and this appeared contrary to the laws of nature. Now, in 1984, when he came out with his theory, when he published his theory, none other than Linus Pauling, who won 2 Nobel Prizes, specifically said that this was quasi-science and could not happen.
Right.
This was printed. Well, needless to say, less than 30 years later, actually in 2009, this was absolutely confirmed. And now these quasi-crystals are used to make very strong materials. Whole new technologies are going to come from this. Whole new advancements, I should say, in technology are coming from this already. But the one more interesting thing was that Dr. Shechtman was working in the United States. He was kicked off his research team at the time because he put this out. So I think this just tells how staid science can be and scientists can be. So it's very timely that we're speaking about these transdimensional technologies because we know that this is happening, and as we will get into this hour. But this is a nice comment on the way science works or can work, that we know that there is so much more to be discovered. It's already there, and that's what we'll speak to today.
Yeah, most of the barriers to this information is basically hubris and scientific arrogance and closed-mindedness, and that's one of the things I always point out to people is that if we were to somehow teleport ourselves back to the time of Thomas Jefferson 200 years ago here, Dr. Bravo and I live very close to Monticello, which is Thomas Jefferson's home here near the University of Virginia. And if you were to show up at Monticello with an Apple iPhone or an iPad, it would be completely something impossible. You would be probably viewed as a warlock or a witch. If you were in Salem, Massachusetts, I suspect you'd be burned at the stake as a witch.
Yeah.
It would be considered something magical and otherworldly or fictitious. And that's just 200 years ago. So to put things in perspective, the evidence exists that this planet has been visited by advanced interstellar civilizations that have been around for thousands, if not millions of years, having interstellar travel capabilities. And if they can travel beyond the stars, it also means they can go beyond the speed of light. And this is the crux of the issue, is what exists beyond linear space-time in other dimensions that is resonating, phasing, fluxing in pulsed fashions that is beyond the speed of light or matter or electrons and goes beyond linear space-time as we know it. That's what we're talking about. Now, what's very interesting, and this is very apropos, a few months ago, a team of scientists, physicists in Japan, did some studies and experiments where it was announced in the media, the mainstream media, that it was absolutely proven that nothing can go faster than the speed of light. They proved it. It can't be done. The theories and the people's ideas that it might be able to be done were completely put to rest by this team of physicists and mainstream scientists, and this is all in the past few months. Then about a month ago or 2 months ago, it was on the BBC and Worldwide News that the CERN accelerator, the super collider, whatever they call it, accelerator in CERN in Geneva, Switzerland, had actually documented particles going faster than the speed of light. And that, in fact, there is that possibility, and not only is it a possibility, it's now a proven scientific certainty. And then, of course, you start dealing with the sort of scientists that Dr. Bravo and I have met with, one of whom is a senior scientist in the Department of Defense, who in the past year told us about experiments that they had done in their lab where they were using communication equipment, where the signals were able to drop out of sort of a linear transmission of electromagnetic signals and were actually being received faster than the accepted speed of light, which is 186,000 miles per second. In other words, the speed of light is every second something would be traveling 186,000 miles. So that's fast. But this was in their laboratory right there in the greater Washington area in a classified lab. And this is a man that we both know very well. So the point I'm making is that when you hear about what we're going to talk about next, and that is how CSETI, the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and you can see what we're doing at CSETI.org, has been having increasing and astonishing levels of contact. It's because we have begun to not only experiment with, but actively engage a paradigm of transdimensional understanding that involves the science of consciousness and thought and other technologies, and we're beginning to get the ability to document some of these experiences even with early 21st century non-classified Earth sciences and technologies and digital photography and audio equipment. So this is what people need to understand, is that we're at this point in our history where the scientific community may naysay a lot of these things, only to then later, as they of course are now with these crystalline research, where they'll then have to sort of say, well, actually we were wrong 25 years ago. And it's interesting because here we are near the University of Virginia, which is a premier university in the United States, where a man some decades ago proved that there was a bacterium that was responsible for many types of the worst bleeding ulcers. The medical doctor, and he actually got run out of the country and had to go to Australia because it flew in the face of the conventional wisdom of it just being too much acid in the stomach causing ulcers. And now, of course, it's malpractice if you don't actually test for this particular bacterium and treat it with a commonly available medicine, antibiotic. And yet, when he proposed this, it was such heresy that he was run out of town on a rail. And the scientific community is replete with these sort of examples where it really isn't about science. It's about whether or not people are open-minded and if they're willing to look at the facts and the evidence and the truth. And that's really one part of this. And this is really what we're doing, is really pushing and stretching the envelope of what is acceptable in the mainstream scientific community, and yet within the classified world, in both the aerospace industry and in various intelligence communities around the world that I've had meetings with, all of this information is accepted as the facts. So it's a total disconnect. And I think what we're trying to do is bridge that gulf between what the common conventional wisdom is and what is known to be true, and then take it into a paradigm where we're using our minds and consciousness and thought to make contact with these extraterrestrial civilizations in a paradigm of universal peace and higher states of consciousness. And so it's pushing the envelope of what would be accepted right now. But then again, many things that we accept as facts today would have been thought of as absolutely impossible 50 or 100 or 200 years ago. And I think that's something we always have to remember.
Agreed. And again, what we will do is we will present not only information but evidence, and other people can, the whole idea is for people to keep their minds open and go on the facts of what we have. So I think it's a very exciting time in this field, and I'm really glad to be a part of this, Steve.
Oh, yeah. It's we're walking through history, no question about it. And each of these CSETI expeditions that have been happening over the last 2 or 3 years have been an exponential increase in contact and documentation of that contact, and but in ways that are not what you would expect. And it goes way beyond what you might see in a Steven Spielberg movie. Thank God. But the point is, we're getting this documentation. Now, one thing I want to point out is that everything that we have available to us in CSETI today that I would want to use, I'll comment in a moment what I mean by qualifying that comment a little bit, are based on electronics, cameras, video cameras, what have you, that were really based in electromagnetic theory of the late 1800s, even though the digital stuff is more advanced. Certainly the night vision technology, which was reverse engineered, by the way, from studying extraterrestrial technologies, they're more advanced, but they're still limited to this linear space-time dimension speed of light. What's interesting is that the new digital high-end cameras, and Emery Smith, who's been on our show before, has just gotten a 25-megapixel Nikon camera that's amazing. And what we're finding, and what the camera specialists have told us, is that those new cameras can pick up energy fields and light beyond what the human eye can see. Now, it's still obviously in this dimension if it's being photographed, but it's beyond what the human eye can perceive. And this, of course, makes sense, just like a microscope. If your eye looked at your skin, you're not going to see the actual down to the cellular level or the mitochondria or what have you, but you can see that under a very good microscope, electron scanning microscopes give all kinds of information that you can never see with your eyes. So what we're finding is that as we go out and make contact, we're beginning to, even with this sort of very clumsy early 21st century technology, getting images and recording events that are both in sound and in light and image that was not possible 10 years ago or 5 years ago even. And this is actually quite exciting, and we're really on the cutting edge of pioneering and experimenting with how to document this level of contact where you might have, for example, an extraterrestrial vehicle that is mostly invisible to the eye, but is literally you can see it shimmering, or an aspect of it scintillating in the field with you. And remote viewing through consciousness and using your mind, you can see the whole craft and everyone on it, but the human eyes are only seeing some flickering or some sparkling of light or scintillations of light. And then the camera will be pointed in that direction, and lo and behold, there's a golden disc hovering right above the floor of the desert. Now, I'm describing something that actually happened a couple months ago in Crestone, Colorado. It's an astonishing photograph. Right. And we are getting more and more and more of these. And what's interesting is that we will begin to experience something like this, and I will point out where I am remote viewing or sensing this sort of electromagnetic field disturbance in linear space-time. They'll take a photograph in that direction, and there'll be a disk or an object or an actual extraterrestrial being there hovering above the ground. And this sounds astonishing to people, and one of the things we want to do in the next year is to come out with an entirely new book and DVD that have all these images in them, because there's so many, dozens of them, hundreds of them actually, that have occurred in the last 2 years. 2 years ago we put out a book called Countdown to Transformation that has a DVD with it, which has many of these sort of images and experiences and auditory tones and what have you on it. However, in the 2 years since then, the volume of data that we're getting has doubled or tripled or quadrupled, probably quadrupled, really.
Yeah.
And that's
absolutely.
what's really exciting.
And actually, as you say that, it's what's exciting about this is you mentioned that you will get a sense of where something is, and that is key. What it means is that we are using all our senses to not just our eyes to confirm something, but then we're getting photographic information as you described. We have for a long time, you have particularly for a long time, having started these protocols, will tell us that you'll see something somewhere. And before we had this capability, some people would sense it, some people would see it, some people wouldn't. But now we're actually getting photographs of what's there, and that's what's so exciting. It's available to all.
Well, and the other thing to remember is that, of course, we've talked about this, but for those of you who are new to the show, the protocols that CSETI has developed are ones that involve three main techniques for making contact with extraterrestrial civilizations capable of reaching Earth and that are visiting Earth. And the first and most important one is in the science of consciousness, and that is the mind of each individual person is actually connected to the wholeness of unbounded universal consciousness of infinite mind. And as Erwin Schrödinger said back in, I believe, 1908, when he was the father of modern quantum mechanics and actually started particle wave theory, Erwin Schrödinger said that the total number of minds in the universe is one. That is, it is a singularity. And everyone who's had these meditative experiences where they've gone into the quiet state of mind and had either a brief or prolonged experience of samadhi or transcendence knows that there's this infinite ocean of pure mind that is completely in its fullness present everywhere, omnipresent. And that means every individual's consciousness, even though we tend to attach it firmly to our egos and our bodies and our sense of identity, the mind stuff, the awareness itself, is in fact a universal pure field of consciousness and mind. And all meditation techniques, and the ones that we teach, are designed to allow the mind to become calm and centered and quiet and begin to experience that expanded infinite aspect of mind. And there's a very advanced mantra that I teach to people that assist in this meditation. And then we do a number of other meditation techniques. And these are all available at disclosureproject.org at the online store for people to get in various CDs. And the purpose of these meditation techniques is to allow the person to first go into pure, quiet mind. And then once they're centered in that silence, to begin to intend to see with their inner sight remote places. It may be the field in front of us. It may be another galaxy. It may be wherever it is that your heart and mind are drawn to. And when you then see an extraterrestrial craft or people or civilization, we connect to their minds and to their communication systems and then vector them into our location, showing them exactly where we are. So let's say, later this month we're going to be in Southern California in the desert. We'll be in a location and we will actually show them the Earth from space and then zoom in and vector into North America and then the West Coast and then the Southern California area and then the desert outside of San Diego and L.A. all the way down to precisely where we're located in the mountains. And what this does is it sets up a vector or a directional opening using what I call coherent thought sequencing. And what this means is that the whole group, you have, say, 25 people there, everyone is doing this meditation together and from this expanded higher state of consciousness. And the extraterrestrial civilizations that are interstellar all have electronics and communication devices that interface with this kind of clear, intended, directed thought when it's emanating from this expanded field of universal consciousness, which is really the universal translator and the universal field. And what happens then is that once we make contact like that, I will feel it. Sometimes I'll actually have an electromagnetic field that will light up around my body, and people will see it, and I will feel it. And we'll have detectors around us, electromagnetic field detectors, magnetometers that measure the magnetic field flux, and these will begin to light up and make sounds. And even though we're in a remote area where there's no man-made source for this, and then we'll have an object fly across the sky, or we'll have something come down in the field very quickly. It may just be something that looks like an orb, but several people will see it. And it'll be there dematerialized because they're being very careful not to draw too much attention, lest the military shoot them, because that's what they're doing. And, however, they'll be there in this transdimensional energy form that you can see scintillating out in the field or above us or behind us or wherever it may be, or in the middle of our circle, actually. And then we'll begin to take images of this with these new digital cameras, and it's astonishing what we're getting. Now, the key thing to understand about this protocol that uses the Vedic concepts of cosmic mind and meditation and mantras is that this is very ancient. Native peoples from all over the world for thousands of years have done some version of this. And the reason it's always worked is because the interstellar civilizations totally understand non-local mind, expanded higher states of consciousness. They cannot travel through these dimensions faster than the speed of light without understanding the astral body, the body of light, the science of consciousness. But moreover, their technologies have evolved to where they reflect that state of consciousness and understanding of reality, so that you'll actually see. I remember talking years ago in the early 90s to a senior aerospace scientist, a PhD scientist with McDonnell Douglas, which is now part of Boeing, Phantom Works. And he said, how do you know all of this? I said, well, I had contact when I was, 18, and this was made very, very clear to me that they have this capability. And he said, well, we have studied this, and old man McDonald himself sent me out to investigate this, and we discovered that there's this nexus where these transdimensional sciences and electromagnetism and consciousness and thought come together, and that they had documented many cases where people would have an encounter with an extraterrestrial being or craft, and they will simply think to it, and there will be a response based on the thought. They won't even have to say anything verbally. And he says you absolutely are correct that there is an interface that they have developed with thought and consciousness from their technologies. And I remember back in the 90s when I briefed the CIA director and his wife about this whole issue, and this was Clinton's first CIA director, and His wife was the head of the National Academy of Sciences, chief operating officer, I should say, of the National Academy of Sciences, and we were having dinner. And while we were eating, this was CI Director Woolsey, she had a PhD, and she had the insight to turn to me and say, how are these civilizations communicating across the vastness of interstellar space? Because she was smart enough to know that at the speed of light, if you were from the Andromeda Galaxy, which is 2.5 million light years from here, and that's the closest galaxy to our Milky Way galaxy, that it would take 2.5 million years for a signal to get there and another 2.5 million years for an answer to come back. It's 5 million years. And obviously, that's just too damn slow. It ain't going to happen. So she knew that it had to involve something. And so it was an interesting experience for me because I'm working full-time as an emergency doctor. I'm there to give a briefing to these very high officials in Washington, one of whom was, a cabinet member of the Clinton administration and CIA director. And I'm going, oh, my God, do I tell this woman the truth and lose all my credibility? Or do I tell her a half-truth that sounds kind of scientific and maintain my credibility? I mean, really. And this is what you get forced with many times with sort of the hidebound scientific community. But I said, no, I am going to tell her the truth. If she's smart enough to answer that question, I'm going to tell her the unvarnished truth. And I told her what I just shared with all of you, and that is they have technologies that interface with coherent, directed thought, and that they can sync to their devices, and like you would to your iPhone, and think to their console of their spacecraft, and that will direct it to appear where it goes. And it's total interface with technology and consciousness. And I explained this to her, and she looked at me and she said, this is Dr. Woolsey, the Chief Operating Officer of the National Academy of Sciences, and she looks at me and she says, I thought it had to be something like that. I just about fell out of my chair.
That's a great story. It reminds me of something. I'm going to get a new iPhone, and the new voice recognition technology is so much better, apparently, than what it's been. And if you think about it, if someone had told you, 60 years ago, even 40 years ago, that you can speak to your phone and it'll do things, dial a number for you in this, you would have said, well, yeah, sure,
right.
Show me. Well, we can do it now. This is just another step along the spectrum to where we're going, and that's what's so exciting about it. What you say, even if someone hasn't experienced it, should just make sense. We're just moving along a spectrum of advancement and technological advancement.
And what's interesting is everything old is new again, because the science of consciousness and the understanding of how this holographic quantum universe that's awake and conscious, and how that can be interfaced with technologically and through scientific means, is really the big sciences of the next 1,000 years. And when we talk about free energy and anti-gravity, these were all things that were figured out in the early 1900s, the mid-1900s. So by 1958, we already had anti-gravity propulsion systems at Lockheed Skunk Works and Lockheed Martin. We had advanced technologies that would pull energy out of the fabric of space-time that would run your house and car for free. And what you see when you talk about this with the average person is that we're about 100 years, I hate to use the word retarded, but our civilization is about 100 years retarded from what it should know about all of these things, never mind the science of consciousness and these advanced technological systems that interface with mind and coherent thought. And one of the things I mention to people is that, a laser, many people don't know what a laser is. A laser is basically, say you have a green laser, that is light, that all the wavelength of green light is all synced up, so the waves are all coherent together, as opposed to multiphasic and scattered like normal light. And what we're doing with our contact protocols is to do exactly that with consciousness with a group of people, where there's sort of this exponential power release from a lot of people experiencing higher states of consciousness, then using this coherent thought process and remote viewing process to connect to these extraterrestrial civilizations, not for curiosity purposes, but for the purpose of making peaceful contact, because we know that they are waiting for people to wake up and to reach out to them in a peaceful, nonviolent way. And this is something that has not happened in an organized way. Now there are thousands of people around the world doing this. And actually, if you have an iPhone or an iPad, you can download a CSETI contact app to it that has all these meditation protocols. It turns your iPhone into a magnetometer that will go off when these craft approach, all kinds of amazing things that Todd Goldenbaum designed, and this app has just been available for the last few months. So if you have an iPhone or an iPad, you can go to the App Store and get that. And because not everyone can come out in the desert or what have you with us for a week, but everyone can do that if they have that iPhone or iPad. Unfortunately, it's not available on the Android system yet. We haven't gotten anyone to convert it into an Android format, but and that's way past my ability. I hate to say it, but I'm not able to do that. So if there's anyone listening who knows how to do that, let us know. It would be great to have this app available for other smartphones. But what's fascinating is that as people begin to experiment with this, who've never even met me, we'll hear from them, and they'll say, oh, my God, I was in Japan, and I had 2 or 3 people, and we were doing these protocols, and this craft showed up, and the magnetometer went off, and they get photographs, and this is happening now worldwide within this context of what we call a close encounter of the fifth kind. And a close encounter of the fifth kind is when humans intend to make peaceful contact and initiate the contact and welcome these extraterrestrial civilizations here. And this is what has not happened that needs to happen since the State Department and the United Nations refused to take on that task. And the military have made this stuff very secret and have tried to weaponize space, have weaponized space, and have actually taken an aggressive stand towards the extraterrestrial presence, using very advanced weapons to target them and shoot at them. You hear about these crash retrievals of UFOs. It's because many of these technologies that are classified that are faster than the speed of light have been turned into weapon systems that have targeted these extraterrestrial vehicles. And that's one of the reasons why we find that frequently we will have a craft that will materialize very briefly, then it'll dematerialize, and it'll stay beyond the veil of light, beyond the crossing point of the speed of light in a higher frequency. But you'll see like a heat wave, like when you're looking down a highway and you see sort of the heat wave, you'll see that shimmering, or you'll see some scintillating light. And if you look then with your mind, you'll see the craft and the beings there. And when we begin to then photograph with either videotape that's with night scope cameras or these very advanced digital still cameras, we begin to get these objects and even these beings in the photographs. And this is, of course, highly experimental, what we're doing, and yet even with how primitive we have today, the technologies are so primitive, we're getting amazing results.
Yes, I will say that some of the sounds we've picked up, they've been analyzed and spoken about on other shows. You may want to check past archives of this show where this has been discussed, perhaps Dr. Greer's discussion with Charlie Baylog. But the sounds are amazing, the cadences, and the colors that people see, people that will see barely in flashes, when they come out in the photos, they're amazing. They're really beyond just what we normally see. There's a certain quality to them that is quite otherworldly and beautiful.
Yeah, it is.
To be able to capture that as we're doing now.
Well, it's virtually celestial looking, and yet it's something on a photograph. And so, it's not a painting. and it isn't photoshopped. One of the things that we do on these expeditions when we're having a contact experience and we get an image like that, often we'll have people come over and see it in the viewfinder right then and there, so there's no question that it wasn't tampered with, that it's there. And we're trying to do this in as careful a fashion as we can. And, of course, I mean, all kinds of things can happen. We're really walking through an entirely pioneering effort. And this is one of the things I want to comment on, is that no one's ever done this before at this level, where you have thousands of people around the world learning advanced states of consciousness and mantra meditation, and then using these CSETI coherent thought sequencing protocols to make contact, and then experimenting with these new cameras and audio equipment and electromagnetic detection devices to see how the contact unfolds. But that's what we're doing. And the team that Dr. Bravo and I are on, and we hold these expeditions and trainings 4 or 5 times a year. Like I said, the next one's going to be in Southern California at the end of October, but that one's already oversubscribed. But we'll be doing it again in Florida, on the Gulf Coast of Florida in April, and we may be doing a project in February in Arizona. So, if you're interested to actually coming to one of these, you should sign up for our mailing list at CSETI.org, and we'll notify you where the next ones will be. But what's the fascinating thing about the technologies that we're using is that they're all limited to this dimension, and they're all limited to things on this side of the speed of light. In other words, we don't have equipment that's picking up things within the astral or the visual thought realm or the transdimensional realms of energy and what have you, and yet we're still getting amazing photographs and auditory recordings, audio recordings that are with off-the-shelf stuff from Radio Shack or Nikon or what have you. Now, granted, some of our equipment, we have an advanced night scope lenses on our digital video cameras, and it's kind of amazing what will come into the field. I mean, we're talking brilliantly lit objects that will just appear 10 feet to 100 feet from us, right in the field where we are, and it'll be on video, and you'll see it fly in. And some of these things you will see with the naked eye, but many of them you will not. And the reason is the eye, frankly, is limited. And, Dr. Bravo and I were actually having dinner this week with a neuro-ophthalmologist, and this issue came up, and he said, yes, absolutely. I mean, the eye, the optic nerve, and what have you is only so good. However, the mind is infinite. And this is what's interesting. I always tell people, the best instrument you're going to have isn't a $10,000 night scope. It's actually your conscious mind. And the nice thing about that is that the hardware and software you need, God gave you. And so I tell people, develop it. And even your physical senses and your chakra system and your ability to remotely hear and remotely see objects with consciousness. These are have been called siddhis, S-I-D-D-H-I-S, the powers and abilities of the ancient masters of the Vedas. But every human has the ability to develop them, whether it's intuition, precognition, remote viewing, and what has been called in the Vedic tradition celestial perception, where even you begin to see with your mind things that are beyond the speed of light and out of this dimension, but that your physical eyes become more and more refined, and your physical hearing and even your bioelectric system of your body become a refined instrument as you experience higher states of consciousness and this state of transdimensional reality. And that's the value of regular meditation every day and practicing the meditation techniques, is because then you develop the ultimate instrument in the cosmos we have with us. It's called our minds and our bodies and our souls. And it'll be a long time before the gadgets and the widgets made by our technologies catch up to that. And yet, we have that now, and we can use it. And that's a point I always want to make, is that whatever we're able to document when we're dealing with transdimensional, faster than the speed of light, extraterrestrial civilizations, is going to be limited but improving over time. But what we can experience in our minds and with our bodies and together as a group, that's unlimited, that we have full capability.
Yeah. And I will say that another thing that's essential, we are talking about consciousness, is a truly peaceful approach to this. We have never had anything from the ETs that we've contacted, any form of chaos or anyone hurt or anything like that, because we approach them peacefully, and that is why they would want to be in touch with us. So that's an important thing to mention that's necessary to bring to this work.
Yes, I mean, the philosophical and ethical underpinnings of it are actually the key underpinnings, along with the science of consciousness and meditative state, and that is that we are doing this as ambassadors of peace as from Earth to these other civilizations who, disclosureproject.org has proven are here. And the governments of the world have failed completely in an appropriate response, and therefore it falls on we the people to do it. Not just here in America, but throughout the world. And I've been very gratified to see people come to these expeditions from South Africa and Malaysia and China and all of Europe and all in South America and Brazil and Australia and New Zealand and you name it. And what's exciting about it is that in and of itself, those of you who understand Rupert Sheldrake's morphogenic fields, where once something begins to be done by a certain number of people, it kind of creates a potential within consciousness, this non-local infinite field of mind that facilitates that happening. And by doing it in this paradigm of higher states of consciousness for universal peace without prejudice and judgment and without fear, that this creates the future that's the only possible future, and that's a future of peace on Earth and peace in space and interstellar peace. And so much of the information on this subject is so negative and so dismaying. And I tell people, well, the only folks who really benefit from all this scary stuff, aside from Hollywood, which has made 18 movies in the last couple of years that have been alien invasion nonsense movies, is the military-industrial complex, which would love to, profit a couple $1 trillion a year over the next few decades, scaring the bejeebies out of people that there's some threat out in space when there is not one. And what's interesting is that by approaching this within this philosophy and ethics of no fear, no prejudice, understanding that basically all conscious life in the universe, whether from this star system or another star system, is emanating from this unbounded field of pure mind, if you will, the Godhead. That supreme aspect of life and light and consciousness is really what the universe is about. And you can understand that by experiencing it first and then putting it into practice. And then when you put it into practice, what you find is, wow, these extraterrestrial civilizations are eager to make contact with humans who get this. Now, well, interestingly, the inverse is also true, and Dr. Bravo and I have seen this, that if there's someone who approaches this with prejudice and fear, and maybe they've read too many UFO books or New Age books about abductions or other stuff, what happens is that those people, whenever they're around, there's no extraterrestrial people or vehicles seen. And as soon as they leave, they come. And I have seen this for 21 years on these expeditions. It's very interesting. It's like they do not want to deal with humans that are still locked in the paradigm of otherness and us versus them and this sort of Manichaean worldview of, it's humans against the world and war of the worlds and all this stuff. They know that sort of belongs to the last yuga, the last era, and that's what's changing. We're in a whole new age of the hallmark of which is enlightenment and universal peace, not sort of recreating the conflicts that various tribes and ethnicities and religions and races and peoples have had on Earth, and then extrapolating that out into space. Now, of course, there are people, both religious and financial and military, industrial type folks, who would like for that to be the case because it maintains the hegemony and the power they have, but it's completely an illusion. I mean, it's the ultimate Truman Show. And so what I say to people is that, free your mind from that and approach these civilizations with a pure heart, a pure mind, and you're going to find that except for the boogeymen that we create in our own minds, there's nothing to be afraid of out there. And so that going with that kind of innocent and pure-hearted framework is really, really key, because if you bring a lot of the baggage that we have been indoctrinated with, because let's face it, all of us have seen movies and read books and heard stories that would tend to make people afraid, that's fear is the mind killer, but it's the spirit killer also. It's very hard to be in this state of equanimity and spiritual centeredness if you've got, your limbic system on overdrive in the fight or flight response because you're afraid. So you have to be in a state of higher consciousness where you go beyond all that propaganda and mind control fear stuff, where you can be in a state of relaxed, peaceful awareness, and then everything is possible. Everything is possible once you know a few basic techniques and know what to look for. And this is the other thing that people benefit from actually coming on the expeditions, is that people will be out there and they will see something. They say, I don't know if I saw it. What did I see? And then three or four other people will see it. And then, lo and behold, it might be on the videotape. But it might be very subtle or very quick, but it's 10 feet outside our circle or inside the circle, where there will be a being that will be moving around the circle that will be in its light body form. And it's not a ghost or something. It's an extraterrestrial being, and the electronics are all going off and sounding, and the magnetometer is beeping. And yet you take a digital photograph, and here's this energy form there right in the circle, or right superimposed on someone or within someone. I mean, it's really amazing. Some would say even bizarre, but it's not bizarre for us. It's become the ordinary.
Right. Actually, what's fun, and this has been repeated over and over again on trainings, someone will mention something, and then someone else in the circle will say, oh, my God, I saw it, and they wouldn't have said anything if someone else hadn't pointed it out. And it's really fun and wonderful for people to have those experiences, because someone confirms their experience, and they, whereas they were questioning, they get the confirmation on site, and that's a really fun experience.
Yeah, and the other thing to understand is that the most common way historically that people have had contact with these interstellar civilizations, I call them TDIS, Transdimensional Interstellar, meaning that they're capable of going from star system to star system faster than the speed of light. If you go faster than the speed of light, you're in another dimension. What's interesting is that probably everyone listening at some point has had what's called a lucid flying dream, where you're in the dream and you're flying over the countryside or over a city, and it's just crystal clear, full color. Well, that is actually your body of light traveling. It's like an astral travel experience. And almost every human on Earth has had this experience. Interestingly, that form, that dimension that the subtle energy body is in, what the mystics have called the astral field of energy, is exactly the form that anything approaches when it goes beyond the speed of light and it's conscious. And so, by the way, that's why that area of so-called Area 51 was called Dreamland, because when you use these technologies, you experience things like you're in a lucid dream or a flying dream. And the Aboriginals of Australia, of course, called it dream time, and they would literally communicate with distant tribes and people and relatives in the dream state. And I tell people that this is the other thing that we train people in, and that is becoming mindful and practicing lucid dreaming. And many times we'll be out, from like 8 o'clock to 1 or 2 in the morning doing these protocols under the stars. And then I instruct people to do a little protocol before they go to sleep and keep a dream journal, and people will have contact in their rooms in this state. And why? Because interstellar civilizations can interface seamlessly, even technologically, with that level of the so-called astral body and the conscious body, the body of light, whatever you wish to call it. And that is something where the experience is incredibly lucid and clear and more real many times than if the craft was hovering over the field or flying across the sky. So, we're dealing with things here that I know are very disturbing for a linear reductionist scientist to hear. And yet, certainly everyone on the World Puja Network understand these concepts, or some of them. But remember that all the ancient peoples who had contact, whether it was the Egyptians or the ancient Mayans, they understood these things. They had protocols, their shamans and their priests and they understood these concepts in consciousness and meditation and what have you. They may not have understood what the ETs were. They may have thought they were gods or something because they didn't understand the cosmos like we understand today. I mean, let's face it. 500 years ago, Galileo was excommunicated by the Pope for daring to say that the Earth revolved around the sun, and it was only a few years ago that he was exonerated. So, this is the sort of the human condition of craziness. But I love the George Santayana quote who says, fanaticism consists of redoubling your effort when you've forgotten your goal. Pretty much sums up
Wonderful.
So much of science and religion, unfortunately, but and all the human endeavors in general. But when you put the fanaticism aside and you begin to realize that this is something that's been going on for millennia, but what's wonderful about now is that we are understanding the science of it, and we are beginning to have folks like Rupert Sheldrake and Larry Dossey, another medical doctor who wrote Recovering the Soul, and other people do work with the biology of belief and these sort of things that really document the conscious aspect of reality, even in mechanical systems, biological systems. And years ago, Dr. Bob John at Princeton, he had the PEER lab, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab. And I spoke with him years ago, and he said, basically what he was doing, for those of you who aren't familiar with Dr. John's work, he was actually seeing how people, their conscious mind and thought would affect a random number generator or a robotic system or a mechanical system. And, of course, it shouldn't happen according to conventional understanding of science and reality, but it did. And if he had one person putting their awareness on a mechanical device, it would have a certain effect. But if you had two people that were unified or loved each other, it wasn't twice as the effect. It was 10 times. It was an exponential effect. So imagine when we gather together, with a couple dozen people out in the desert, and we're in this state of awareness together, the potentiation in the field, the unbounded mind that happens, and the sort of morphogenic field activation that happens. And Dr. John said to me, he says, well, basically you're applying through contact with these extraterrestrial civilizations what I've demonstrated is possible in the lab. I said, that's correct. And, he was really very interested and supportive of what we were doing. And I said, well, and you add on to it the level that we're actually doing this as a diplomatic mission, an ambassador team, because let's face it, President Obama and President Sarkozy and Medvedev of Russia and the UN Secretary General, they are not doing this yet. And maybe it's just as well. Maybe it's more appropriate that the people who understand these sciences of consciousness at the World Puja Network would be doing it. And it's to us, the people, to lead the way.
Right. And it is available to all. We can't say it enough. You can develop these skills. if you wish.
Yeah, I mean, one of the misconceptions is that you have to kind of lay on a bed of nails for 30 years and then emerge from the cave having had these abilities. And I tell people that every human being at some point has had a transcendent experience, a remote view experience, a precognition, a lucid dream of the future that then happens. And if you just look at the reality of your own conscious mind and be quiet for a while and learn to meditate, become silent, these realities open up very quickly. And I completely reject the idea that it has to be, one guru or a chosen person or a chosen anything. I think you have to choose. It's not, the old saying, many are called but few are chosen. I don't think that's the correct translation. I think many are called but few choose to answer the call. And I remember Paramahansa Yogananda wrote that it's mostly out of spiritual lassitude, laziness, and lack of adventuresomeness that people don't develop all these awesome abilities that every human being has. And so you just have to study them, learn them. And it isn't even that difficult to learn. I mean, there was a man who is sort of a holistic medical doctor who's come on a number of these expeditions in the past 12 months who has, 30, 40 years of meditation experiences, has done stuff with many, many meditators. And in a week, he experienced more on one of these expeditions and these training protocols and meditation techniques that we teach than he had in the previous 30 or 40 years, and he told us this. And it just blew his mind, and the whole universe has opened up. And I tell people it's because it's really simple, and people make it way too difficult. I tend to be a very direct and kind of earthy guy on one level, and it's like, this is really how you can do this, and you can sit, do this meditation, do this mantra. It's a very powerful mantra. Learn to remote view distant places in your mind and use this coherent thought sequencing to contact them and direct these ET spacecraft or these beings right to your location. And everyone can do that. And I know that this has been very upsetting for people, some of the people in the intelligence community who are appalled that I'm teaching people this, and there's been all kinds of defamation and calumnies and lies told about me for this reason. But the reality is that we just need to move on, that this is a fundamental right of every human being to be awake and to make peaceful contact with these extraterrestrial civilizations. And if you just know that it's possible and then begin to put one step in front of the other to do it, what you find is amazing, the doors that open. The doors just open.
Right.
So another, one last thing, we're about to run out of time, but one of the things that I think is very exciting about this whole new science and transdimensional area of science is that you don't need a whole lot of really expensive equipment to do this. You can do it with your mind. At disclosureproject.org, the CDs and training tapes and the meditation tapes are all there, and they're very inexpensive. What's really more important is your attempt to do it and say you will do it, and to know it can be done. The other thing is to understand that even the documentation of it, I mean, a lot of what we're using are off-the-shelf things like magnetometers that you can get from Radio Shack, or a radar detector that you would use to pick up a police car's radar, but we don't use in Virginia because it's illegal, but you can use them out in the field. And then we have cameras. One of the most astonishing pictures ever taken was by Raven Nabulsi, who's on our board, who took it about a year and a half, 2 years ago at Joshua Tree, and it's at CSETI.org, of an extraterrestrial hovering right outside our circle, a being, an actual being that we had vectored in. Prior to her taking the picture, we had seen this luminous orb float in the desert for a few seconds and then disappear, and then we heard a group of 3 or 4 ET voices talking. Literally multiple people heard these sounds, and we didn't know the language, and I had very advanced night scopes, looked over where the sounds were coming from of these voices. There's nothing but empty desert. But she connected to them in her mind and asked them if they would mind being photographed. She took a photograph with a really inexpensive 35 millimeter digital camera. It wasn't, a $5,000 new Nikon camera or anything like that. And she just connected with her mind and asked them if they took the picture. It was about a 4-second exposure, and in the frame is this extraterrestrial being absolutely hovering there. And there's an orb that he's in a cone of light. And this photograph is at CSETI, CSETI.org. It doesn't look all that great on the internet, but when you see it on the actual, like a high-definition screen, you go, my God, it's a person hovering in the desert right outside our circle. And this sounds to most people like this cannot be true. And it is, though. It's 100% true. Dr. Bravo was there when this happened. I was there. 30 or 40 other people were there. And
yeah, may I say there's an extensive explanation of it. We didn't just take the picture and put it up. We went back to the place, took daylight pictures, measurements. Please read all about it after you look at the picture. It's very important.
Yes, and actually we went back and took nighttime pictures of say, a flashlight and what it would look like in the desert, and all it's with the same camera settings and the same camera. This is the kind of thing that, and so everyone can begin to do this and even begin to experiment with documenting it. And it's interesting because we're making contact and doing this with things that cost a few $100s. And then you have the NASA programs and the SETI program, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, different from CSETI, the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence is our organization, where they're spending millions and hundreds of millions of dollars on giant radio telescopes, and they tell the public they haven't gotten anything in 30 or 40 years. And I tell people it's because they're looking in the wrong place, in the wrong spectrum, in the wrong state of mind. But ironically, we're out there with electromagnetic detectors and radar detectors and fairly inexpensive cameras and what have you, getting this kind of amazing evidence and proof of contact. And it's very exciting, which means that everyone listening can do it.
Right. And we'll keep bringing you information as we get it.
Right, exactly. That's what this is all about. Well, Dr. Bravo, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
And I'd like to thank everyone at the World Puja Network for hosting us every 2 weeks here and bringing you an update and more information on what CSETI.org is doing and DisclosureProject.org is doing. And I hope to see some of you at one of these expeditions in 2012. I think we're going to have amazing events happen in 2012. And until then, keep looking up, and God bless all of you. Bye-bye.